Hey guys, welcome back to the Woven Energy Podcast with me, Joseph Sikora, and Damon Smith. And as always, we're here to talk about shamanism from the ground up. And today is going to be one of those episodes where we're just going to have a bit of a chat and a bit of a recap because we've got a few announcements to make. First of all, we have a Patreon account. And this Patreon account, correct me if I'm wrong, Damon, is a joint Patreon account between Woven Energy and your new Heretics podcast, which you do with Graham Barlow. And it is a podcast all about the miasma. So, we've been talking about it on this podcast for a while. We've been talking about doing a miasma podcast, and so that's now a reality. So, Damon, do you want to talk
a little bit? It was a joke, right?
It was a bit of a joke, wasn't it?
It was a joke, yeah.
What was it?
Well, it isn't anymore. It's real.
The Crazy Silliness of Society podcast or something.
Yeah, it's gone crazy. A slightly different direction. Initially, it's gone a slightly different direction to what we originally said. We were going to look very much at the to start off with the Western religious aspects and the Christian tradition.
Yes.
Actually, because of my co-host, Mr. Barlow, largely, it's been dragged into Japanese Chinese history and subjects relating to Japanese and Chinese martial arts initially, but obviously we still intend to cover Western esotericism and topics of that nature as well.
Yes. Before we do continue, I wanted to reiterate that last episode we talked about the spirit dance, and so we're going to park that for just this one episode and then revisit that next episode where we're going to explore many different examples of the spirit dance that you can find here, there, and everywhere scattered throughout the world, which I'm really looking forward to. So we are going to get right back on track next episode as far as stage 3 goes. But for this episode, we're going to dive back to the miasma and try and do a bit of a recap on the miasma and maybe shed a bit of new light. Is that right, Damon? Is that what you've got?
Yeah,
planned?
That's right. I mean, the Heretics podcast, even though it's about the miasma, we sort of leapt straight into history, and there's a lot of historical stuff on it at the moment. And so I think the miasma is actually, as a subject, is actually still better covered on the Woven Energy podcast.
Yes.
And we need to slightly put that right. So this particular episode I view as the Woven Energy podcast helping out the miasma stroke heretics podcast by doing a condensed version of our enormous series of episodes. I think that was 13, 14 and 15. And we've covered it in other episodes as well, haven't we?
Yes, we have. Well, first of all, let's introduce the Patreon account because I think we need to know people. Our loyal listeners would like to know what it's all about, how they can help out if they wish, and also the where the money's going to be spent and what they can look forward to in the future. So, do you want to talk a little bit about Patreon?
Sure. So we set up a Patreon account for both Woven Energy and Heretics. It's a joint account. The URL is patreon.com. That's patreon.com/Woven Energy, all one word, WOVENENERGY. And the original idea of that account was so that our listeners could help us a little bit with the hosting costs, the cost of hosting the podcasts. So we put the fairly unambitious target of $25 a month to cover that off. We have already smashed that target.
Yeah. I'm just going to interject for a second and just make sure people are aware of what Patreon is. So basically, when people like you and me do things for free online that we consider very high value stuff, which we consider the Woven Energy podcast to be, we consider it to be very high value and very useful to people, but we do it for free. And so what Patreon was set up to do was to allow people that consume that content and enjoy that content and benefit from that content to give something back to the creators if they wish. It's a really nice sort of system because it doesn't oblige anybody to give any money if they don't wish to, or they can't afford to. You're still going to get all the same podcast. You're still going to get the same material from us. It's just a way for you to support us. That's what it is. And I think become a patron.
It's really important to note that as far as we're concerned, every penny of the money will be spent on the project. There's no money going to individuals. Like I said, we do this for free. And originally, originally, like I say, it was to cover the hosting costs for the podcast, but now, we've been working on the Grove for a while.
Yes.
And now that we've got a slightly more money than we asked for originally, we're now thinking, hey, can we accelerate the Grove project by using some more better suited or more expensive technologies to get that thing moving? And so we'll be putting original $25 a month target. We'll put a higher target up there. And the purpose of that target is simply to help us with the Grove, which is a much more expensive undertaking in terms of hosting, in terms of the software that we're using than are the Heretics and Woven Energy podcasts. So just to be clear about that.
it might spur us on to get some more Woven Energy podcasts out as well if we have a good number of people contributing.
Absolutely. Well, Heretics has been going thick and fast, hasn't it? I think it's because Graham lives a slightly more regular lifestyle than either of us.
Well, you know what the problem is? It's because of this podcast in itself that we're not doing it anymore, because it's made me realise a few things in my life, and I'm extremely busy. So for the first time, you get a hard rap, Damon, for the stuff that you start and then never finish or never follow through on. Well, I'm the guilty party here because time is a slippery thing for me at the moment.
In a way, you wouldn't be doing that stuff if it wasn't for
That's
this
exactly
stuff,
what I meant. So, absolutely.
Yeah,
It spurred me on to really address things in life.
And what Joe's referring to is this Creative Piano Academy, which is fantastic. If anybody hasn't seen it, get yourselves over to YouTube, Creative Piano Academy. What a professional job the guy's done of it. And it's rather popular, to say the least, certainly compared to our podcasts.
But that's taught me a lot of things as well, doing that as a project. But anyway, enough waffling about that. So
cool.
If you do want to learn the piano, it is piano focused. But yes, you can head over there and YouTube/Creative Piano Academy.
Cool.
So anyway, back to Patreon. We have a few mentions, don't we, of patrons who are contributing already. We have to let the world know of these lovely people.
We said we would mention them all by name, so that's what we're going to do. I'm going to read them out. Just to note, a couple of them have asked to be, well, one of them's asked to be known by his first name only, which is just fine, so that's what I'm going to do. But just for this particular bunch of people, I just want to say thanks so much for caring. When we set up the Patreon account, I did it half with the expectation that the only people who would contribute were people that we knew. And actually that's not what's happened. We seem to have friends around the world. We have 7 patrons so far. And like I say, we've almost doubled what we asked for initially. And like I say, the new higher target will be focused mostly around the Grove and the development of the Grove. So if you'd like to help us with that and get if you like our Shamanism Training Institute up and live online, then please feel free to head over there. I should have mentioned, you can support us from as little as $1 a month. We do have a $1 support level. And then there's a few other levels. At the $5 and $7 levels, there's a bunch of content unlocks on the Patreon blog that I think is quite useful. So every episode that we're doing from now on, I'm doing a bunch of episode notes afterwards, and they're going up there. So I think it's quite valuable. And so,
well, that might be pretty good for our Spirit Dance example episode.
Absolutely.
We can try and put some stuff.
Like
up
I said,
there.
Very often I say, I wish I'd mentioned this, I wish I'd mentioned that after the episode. Those notes are really good for me, because it's a chance for me to write down all the stuff I wish I'd mentioned. So that's what's happened. So I think there's only two episodes of Heretics I've done it for so far, but I do intend to do it for just about every episode from now on. And like I say, that's exclusive to patrons of the $5 level and above. Our wonderful patrons, our first round of patrons. It's amazing to get patrons who, I've never met. It's just wonderful. None of us have ever met, I guess, some of them. So thank you guys so much for being our very, very first patrons. We have 7 of you. We have Adam C., Chris Posner, Colin Ami, Gashwa, Glenn Bord, Casper, and Tamo. Tamo's a recent friend of ours who's been really, really helpful in setting up the podcast. And Colin is a very, very old friend of mine. And so, but like I say, some of the people who are supporting us and who care about what we're doing, I've never met. That is just a wonderful, wonderful thing. It's so nice to know that we're not just firing these episodes out into the ether.
into the mist.
Because I think, we often wondered whether it's simply some sort of search engine downloading the episodes and and nobody's actually listening to them. So
in essence, this is it's quite shamanic in a way, isn't it? We just sort of sit here and talk into a microphone and blast these things off into space, and it's nice to know that there are people out there that are absorbing it. And
yeah,
we never
absolutely.
thought. I mean, Woven Energy's got a nice little group now, and we know there's quite a hefty amount of people that listen to us now. So it's really nice. Yeah. It's nice to know that it's slowly building. And we haven't done any promotion for this podcast whatsoever. I mean, I did a few things back in the early days, but this is just grown organically, and super proud of what we've done. And I think it's good. It's good.
To me, it's quite uplifting. I was shocked, to be honest, because it hasn't been there very long, that Patreon page. I was shocked. Wonderful. Thank you so much, guys. Wonderful.
Yeah. So, right, brilliant. So now we're going to talk about a summary of the Miasma. Before we get cracking, the episodes, if you're coming to this episode from the Heretics podcast, the episode that you could listen to in addition to this one are episodes 13, 14, and 15. Those are the episodes that we did solely and specifically on the Miasma, and we dived pretty deep into that. It was over 3 hours worth, I think, of depressing talk on how screwed up the world is. So if you're into that kind of stuff, then go and check those episodes out. But Damon, over to you. We're going to be talking about the Miasma.
Okay, so I guess our task for today is pretty much to summarize those 3 episodes. Now, first of all, the word miasma. It's a word that we use a lot. I mean, in our own discussions, when me and Joe used to go and sit in a coffee shop and talk about this stuff, either before or after our practice, it's a word that came up a lot. It refers to unspoken or unacknowledged characteristics or aspects of any given civilization that people carry with them through their lives. And very often the things that they carry with them are created by the society and culture that they're a part of. But that's not often how that's perceived by the person themselves. They perceive it as, very often they perceive the miasma as part of themselves. And you see this a lot in the use of the English language in terms of people saying things like, I'm not the sort of person who, and then there'd be ... on the end of that, whatever it is. Or I'm the sort of person who generally ... whatever the thing is. And there are other people in the world who would say different things at the end of those 2 sentences. And so it's fairly arbitrary what comes on the end of those 2 sentences. So, if I take myself, I think back to when I was maybe 18 years old, I'm not the sort of person who would have my own business. That wouldn't happen. I didn't come from that kind of background.
Same here, mate.
Nobody in my family ever did that. They were all, to be honest, most of my relatives were teachers. Going back in time in my family, I believe my great uncle owned a shop. That was probably the closest to private enterprise, like a corner shop. I know where it was, actually, in the northeast of England. But in general, you would say they were kind of public sector workers, if you like, and also I come from a very socialist kind of family, and so that kind of thing wouldn't really have occurred to me. Now, whether I've got my own business or not is kind of irrelevant to shamanism, but the point is that I had that kind of worldview of myself that wasn't the sort of thing. I mean, it didn't occur to me that was the sort of thing that could happen, and yet it has, and that comes through my education in shamanism and various subjects related to shamanism. That change in me. We don't really have a word for this thing in English, this sort of cultural baggage that we carry with us. We instead, I think just don't talk about it, or choose not to talk about it, or it's a kind of non-subject. And what's very interesting is that that's true, that lack of a word for it is true with most languages of countries or cultures that have been quote-unquote civilized. I'm not using civilized as a value judgment, I'm just mean that have been settled populations with organised religion and organised political structures for a long time.
With various disciplines, we've kind of looked back on it and formulated certain concepts which might tackle bits of it, because we do have terms like social conditioning over in the West, don't we, in English, which refers to a part of the miasma. And so it's recognised in certain fields and certain terms, but not as a whole, right?
Yeah. So social conditioning, as we discussed on the big episodes on the miasma, is a concept that grew out of the tradition of Freud, and which is often known as sort of psychology, sociology, these sort of subjects. And social conditioning is definitely related to the miasma, but it's not the be-all and end-all of it. And also in those traditions, especially in psychology tradition, that has a huge amount of its own miasma, that tradition. And so one of the ways that I've described the miasma is to use a kind of mathematical formula. Shamans and esotericists to a certain extent are very concerned to come close to the real world, to the natural world, to remove the differentiation between themselves and the natural world. That's one of the things that shaman tries to do. I mean, they do it for purpose. They do it to gain knowledge from the natural world, but they want to remove that differentiation. So the equation is reality equals everything minus the miasma. And so that's kind of mathematical equation for what it is. And the miasma is a very broad-ranging term. Yeah.
What I like to think about in terms is like a veil. So like a wedding veil or a fencing mask or something which like it sits in front of you and it's got that haze that you can see the world through it, but it just looks like it's all hazy and stuff. And
yes.
It just sits between you and what reality is. And your job is to poke holes in it. Your job is to try as best as you can to sort of just peek through the veil and try and poke holes in it. To
Absolutely.
Lift up the veil if you can, yeah.
And that's a continual process, and that's what we're talking about. Stage 1 of learning shamanism, working on Chalisti, that's what it's all about. It's all about getting rid of all of that stuff. And so what stuff do you need to get rid of? Your beliefs, your opinions, your worldview, your categorizations, your prejudices, obviously, and your judgments. In the state of Chalisti, all of that stuff has to go, because all of that stuff is part of the miasma. Now, I'm not saying that there aren't good aspects to that stuff, but good or bad, it remains part of the miasma. It's like looking through coloured lenses at the world, and those coloured lenses need to be removed because they stand as a barrier. The miasma stands as a barrier, like dust on a mirror. If you pick most wild animals, they reflect the environment and the situation very immediately. Something happens, something changes, and they react immediately. And there's a very little distinction between them and nature. They're there and they're part of it. Whereas for human beings, certainly civilized human beings, since we ceased to live in hunter-gatherer societies and we moved into things like pastoralism, then agriculture, then technological civilizations, we've achieved a lot of good stuff, but at the same time, we've left something behind us. And that something that we've left behind us is this immediacy that wild animals have within their environments. And I think we all know it to a certain extent, because we all have it when we're children, right? When we're very young children. Everything appears very crisp, doesn't it? When you're a very young child, if you can remember back, everything's very crisp and immediate. And we get this dulled edge that Joe's talking about. Now, I can't remember what it was. You came, der state, that was the term you came up with.
Well, that happens to you. I mean, that happened. I remember very strongly when that kind of feeling came over me, and it was definitely sort of the puberty kind of time. But with children, there's that inbuilt mechanism of play, isn't there? There's a play mechanism in children that is biologically in us in order to teach us Toshalteen, what we call Toshalteen.
Yeah, absolutely. And that play mechanism tends to suppress the development of the play and experimentation tends to suppress the development of the miasma. However, there are so many things in our modern childhoods that tend to reinforce the development of the miasma. So think of it as a wild animal, like a clean mirror reflecting the world with great immediacy, whereas as we develop the miasma, it's like dust piling up on that mirror. And shamanic practice, shamanic technique is partly about trying to sweep away the dust. At least that's the first stage of shamanic technique, which we refer to as Chalisti, Bagtamshtesab in Mongol. And what I was going to say was that actually, although we are these sort of what you would call civilized cultures, don't have words for the miasma. That's why we've had to just take this word miasma that doesn't really mean that and repurpose it. The languages of animistic and shamanistic peoples do have words for the miasma. So in Mongol there's the word Tiran, in Siberian, Bavenk there's the word Uha. Even in Japanese, we have words like Hokori and Ashiki, Ilhwa in Aboriginal. And actually we've said that, Mongolia has been such a shamanistic place that they have loads of words, absolutely loads and loads of words, more Nukhlau, various others for the miasma. And yet we haven't got a single word for it. We've had to sort of repurpose our own. There's no accident in that. And one of the things that I think is important to understand is that part of the miasma didn't develop accidentally. Part of it developed accidentally because we left behind the lifestyle that we were used to, which was being hunter-gatherers. We're out there in the world without much of a safety net, in very small groups of people, and we're hunting and gathering for a living. With that, we need that immediacy so that we're successful in our hunting and in looking after ourselves so we don't get killed by other wild animals, if we consider ourselves as wild animals when we're hunter-gatherers. We needed that immediacy, but as soon as we started settling down, building walls around ourselves, or even just herding animals, if I'm ill and I don't feel like going out hunting today, hey, I've got a whole herd of cows, I can go get some milk and all that kind of stuff, We started to build up this miasma, but so part of that was sort of accidental, if you like, but also part of it was deliberate.
People have been using it, haven't they? They know it and they use it in order to control people.
Exactly.
Donald Trump, Hitler. If you want to know about the miasma, go study those guys, and I'm sure there's equal amounts of people on the left as well. But it's just those two spring to mind. But
so what happened?
It's amazing when you view what they do through the lens of the miasma and how they can control so easily. Or, like you said once, get people to control themselves.
Exactly. That's much easier, isn't it? It's much easier to get people to self-police than it is to enforce a rigid set of controls upon them. Listeners to the Heretics podcast will be very familiar with this. We did an episode about Qin Shi Huangdi, the first emperor of China, who was a bit of
Speaking of China, I've thought of one. Mao. There we go. He'll have used it as well, won't he?
Absolutely, yeah. At some point in time, we will definitely be getting on to Mao and Heretics,
Mao
I tell you. That's
Stalin and all those devious people.
So Qin Shi Huangdi, first emperor of China, was into a thing called legalism. And basically, he set out what he expected of his subjects, and then if they didn't do what he wanted, it was just time for the most horrendous punishments you can possibly imagine. And that was pretty much his system of government. Well, his dynasty didn't last very long. And the reason is that he wasn't subtle about it. He wasn't using the miasma. He was using the force or might of his military and his police and the rule of law. And that's a bad way to control people, because you have to police them when you use that kind of a system.
It sparks uprising as well, doesn't it? It's
exactly, and it did very, very quickly. Very quickly. Alternatively, if you create a culture or religion where the people who are in your civilization look to you with a kind of religious reverence, thinking about the pharaohs in Egypt, for instance, then they're not going to do anything to harm you, because it's their religion to revere you. They're there to help you. They're there to promote you and rather than using the might of your armies to keep them in line, they can self-police themselves. And so you invent religions, these organized religions, that have sprung up all over the world, and you incorporate traits into them that preserve your position at the top of society, that preserve the position of the elites within society. And this happened all over the world, and that's a much cleverer way to do it. And this happened, for instance, during the subsequent Han Dynasty. They did exactly this. They consciously created religious and cultural concepts that people started believing in, which tended to promote the Han rulers. And surprise, surprise, the Han rulers lasted for 400 years, unlike the previous, command and control might dynasty that lasted not much more than one guy's life. And so the key is that part of the miasma has been consciously constructed. It's deliberate, and
you don't know you are prey to it either, do you? You don't know that.
You never
its
do.
Effect
you never
on
do. You always think it's you. The most ingrained part of the miasma is something that you identify as yourself.
You're okay. You know everything, but everybody else, oh no, they're
exactly
steeped in this thing.
Yeah. And there's the famous quote about cat videos. The what has happened to us and what has happened to our relationship to nature. In my opinion, if we as a species don't turn back towards nature at least a little bit, in the very near future, we are in a lot of trouble. This is probably a really good quote. We've said it before several times on the Woven Energy podcast, but I don't think we've ever said it on the Heretics podcast. And we're hopefully going to have Heretics people listening to this episode. So it was a quote on a YouTube video. And it goes like this: while cat videos remind us how cute animals can be, out in the wild it's a depressing dog-eat-dog world of death, disease and distrust. Now that is exactly the kind of thing that a member of a highly miasmatic, civilized society would say. It's exactly not the kind of thing that a hunter-gatherer would say. And if you recall, my response to that was an evidential response, which is, if that's true, why are hunter-gatherer peoples always smiling and laughing and joking and having a good time? More so than our settled civilized peoples. And also, in the archaeological record, why are there so many instances of hunter-gatherer peoples finding agriculture, trying civilization for a while, getting an extreme distaste for it, and then going back to being hunter-gatherers again? And the answer to that is the miasma. The miasma, in those reversion societies, they've realized that their lives are actually better. If you think about, we're not talking about modern agriculture here, we're talking about early agriculture. People
it's
really
not,
had to
and also
graft.
with that quote, it's not saying like that that quote, nature's red in tooth and claw. It's not saying that the world is this horrible battleground and all this kind of stuff, because it kind of is in a way. It's more that, like the Garden of Eden story, I guess. It's just when you're embedded in it and it's part of you and you are one with the natural world, it just is what it is.
So put it another way, the prospect of being eaten by a tiger, Yeah. That's not a very nice prospect. It's an ambush predator. It's going to make short work of you very quickly because, human beings, however good they are at martial arts, are not going to last very long when a tiger wants to make a meal of them.
Apart from that jogger, did you hear about that?
No, what was that?
A jogger in America that was out running up the mountains, got attacked by I think it was a kind of tiger, and he BJJ'd it.
Wow. He BJJ'd it. Are you sure we're not talking about like a mountain lion or something?
It might have been a mountain lion, yeah, but he choked it out.
He choked it out. Wow, that's cool. That is cool. But that's not a tiger, mate. At least I would be very surprised because there's no tigers wild in North America. I think it was a mountain lion. And yeah, we're talking about two very different different beasties here. But yeah, amazing. If a bit of technical knowledge, what you can do. I dare say he was hurt if that's a true story.
Oh, he was.
If he wasn't badly hurt, I would be very surprised. But that's obviously a good approach. I strongly suspect it wouldn't work on a tiger, but just the size of things and how powerful they are, and how fast they are because they're ambush predators, But the bottom line is it's the attitude, isn't it? A hunter gatherer, in Africa, maybe one of the Sand people, they can be killed by a lion, but the prospect doesn't bother them the same way the prospect would bother somebody and that's the miasma.
Yes,
it's this distaste for nature. Think of it another way. When people are nervous when they're flying on airplanes, or another one, even on going on a fast train, something like that, like the bullet train in Japan, the Shinkansen. Going at that speed, close to 200 miles an hour down the railway track, you might think, oh, this is a bit faster than I go in my car. So you might feel a little, actually it's great fun going on those things, but anyway, you might feel a little trepidation depending on the kind of person you are, based on the fact that you're traveling along from, say, Osaka to Tokyo, 200 miles an hour, close to. Compared to, if you're doing the same journey in your car, you might be doing 40 if you're lucky. You might feel safer in your car. There is no way in a million years you are safer in your car. The Shinkansen famously has 100%, I think it was 1965 or something it opened. Nobody has died on the Shinkansen in all that time, whereas how many people have died in car accidents in Japan in that time, It's this type of thing. And it's basically our attitudes, our judgments, the way we deal with the world, and everybody has it. And I don't claim to be free of the miasma. I don't think anybody is. But when you're in your shamanistic practice, with practicing Chillicity, you go into that state, you can get free of it. That's what Chillicity practice, level 1 practice in shamanism is all about. If there are any heretics listeners wondering what that's about, then just start listening from the start of the Woven Energy podcast. Unlike heretics, the Woven Energy podcast is very sequential. It just goes from the basics from episode 1 and sort of works forwards. Whereas in heretics, we've tried to keep a few threads going through it, but actually we jump around all over the place and intend to continue to do so. And so one of the ways that the miasma draws its strength is by making us fear nature. And this has been important to ruling elites throughout time. If you think of the attitude that, the Christian church had in the Middle Ages in Europe towards people who were interested in studying nature, a lot of those people ended up tied to a post with some logs put underneath, and fire was involved. That's how down on nature very miasmatic people can get. And like you said, exactly the Adam and Eve story. Adam and Eve ate of the apple representing knowledge of nature, understanding of nature, and they had to be kicked out of the garden. That kind of shows you, way to put it, think of a young child, right? There's in literal terms, a young child, you put them in the garden, there's a nice big tree with nice juicy apples on it. And you say, don't eat the apple. Don't eat the apple. Whatever you do, don't eat the apple. Oh, no, maybe a box of sweets or something. Don't eat the sweets. Whatever you do. Really young children I'm talking about, innocent children. And then surprise, surprise, you find they have eaten it. Surprise, And then so you inflict pain in childbirth on them. And, it just shows you how vindictive and unpleasant some of those ruling elites were in the past when they were making their fairly sordid little religions. Because in those days there were little religions.
It's how sadistic can you get?
Yeah, exactly. And actually, we talked about people like Qin Shi Huangdi. They do get even worse, But
what is it? Death by 1,000 cuts.
Exactly.
It's ridiculous, man.
Death by 1,000 cuts is a great example of the miasma at work. No hunter-gatherer. I mean, hunter-gatherer, to say there's no way that murder doesn't exist in hunter-gatherer societies. It does. I suspect the murder rate is way lower than it is in civilized societies, but that sort of thing does exist. That's just about people getting ludicrously angry with each other. In civilized societies, that's very different. In a lot of those, for people who don't know, I don't know whether I should describe it or not, but in Chinese society, there was a long death penalty called Death of 1,000 Cuts, where they basically just tied your post and start cutting off little bits of you one at a time.
Starting with your eyelids, don't forget that.
Lots of ludicrously unpleasant death. Only a highly miasmatic civilization like China would come up with something like that.
Yeah, and then what do they kill off 3 generations as well?
Yeah, oh yeah, and yeah, that's it. Well, isn't that just like the original sin in the Adam and Eve story, where Adam and Eve sinned, if you want to call it sin? I just really don't see how eating the apple was a sin in the first place, And of course, the snake gets cast down on the ground because he sorted it all out, didn't he? The snake being a representative of nature as well, right? So and not only do they have to be punished, but all their descendants and their descendants have to be punished. This is what the original sin's all about, isn't it? And then how many millions, even billions of Christians over the generations have beaten themselves up over these supposed sins that, they're not only not that bad, a lot of them are actually, some of them are, but a lot of these things that they call sins are actually just completely natural reactions to the natural world, They're part of our limbic system in scientific terms. It's worth mentioning that we did an episode or 2 on the science behind this as well, didn't we? I just can't remember.
Are you talking about the Amsker, just before the Amsker?
Yeah, I think so.
In which case, that's episode 16, possibly 17.
Yeah. And so I think that hopefully these are a few examples. I mean, we did quite a bit on the Salem witch trials as well, to summarize that briefly, in order to control people, in order to invoke my will, I invent fictions, things that don't exist. So one of those things is Satan, fiction that I've invented or somebody in the past invented. Another one of those fictions is a witch, no such thing in those days, late 17th century. No such thing as a witch in those days. There is now, the Wicca people. Hi, if we have any Wiccans listening, I love you guys, but you are not who I'm talking about. In those days, no such thing as witches, and a legal system that allows me to execute one fiction on the basis that they're in league with the other fiction. This is another thing, the miasma, and it allows elites to maintain control. The Salem witch trials, as I think we said when we covered them, it's a bit unfair because relatively few people died compared to how many people died in the witch hunts in Europe. But they are the most famous witch trials. And there's another great example of the miasma at work among a Puritan society in Massachusetts. The Puritans had built themselves this incredibly heavy miasma where they thought that people's lives were less important than fictitious things that they'd invented in their own minds. And to be honest, the only reason that stuff came to an end was that people from the elite started getting accused, and they started getting a taste of their own medicine, and then they had to put a stop to it then. Yeah. So one of the ways is that one of the things with the miasma is its negative, often unquestioned aspects of cultures that are there deliberately, or, originally they might have been deliberately created, but it just becomes part of how it is, doesn't it? And soon the elites buy into it as
Nowadays you've got these things called movies, haven't you? And for the past 100 to 200 years, we've got documents, almost like documents of the time, quote unquote. And so you could very easily check out some, even books or movies from 40 or 50 years ago, and you can immediately see the difference of how people thought and acted and viewed the world, even just 30 or 40 years ago, as opposed to right now.
Exactly.
It's quite stark in some cases, especially with attitudes towards women and stuff like that.
Exactly. And you see it. I mean, it's you can always see it in somebody else's culture, can't you? In the world today.
But you don't see it changing day to day. You just if you can see a snapshot of it, which was so good now. If you see a snapshot of it from 40 years ago, boom, you can learn from that if you view it through with the right attitude.
The key point is the people who are affected by it, and it has many negative repercussions and has throughout time. They don't believe that what they're doing is wrong. So we mentioned Inca child sacrifice. The Incas sacrificed children in order to appease the gods and make sure that they had enough food to eat. They create this link in their miasma between sacrifice of children and food to eat. The fact that there was no causal link between those two things whatsoever, the reason that they didn't have enough food to eat was entirely due to their mismanagement of nature, the fact that they were exploiting their environment. It had nothing to do with the fact that they were one sacrificing children. But the guys who did those sacrifices, most of those guys truly believed that they were doing the right thing. They didn't think they were going and doing evil. They thought they were doing the right thing. They were just completely and sincerely wrong about that. And this is another issue. Sincerity is another part of the miasma. A lot of societies certainly Japanese society, Makoto in Japanese, they place a huge emphasis on sincerity. Yeah. But, it's possible to be extremely sincerely deluded. It's possible to be extremely sincerely bad. And it's possibly to be extremely sincerely wrong. And this is one of the problems with sincerity and how sincerity is part of the miasma. And I feel that as a species, we shouldn't be placing such a high value on sincerity. It is true that a lot of people find it rather attractive. Adolf Hitler came over as very sincere in the years before he fully rose to power, and he attracted a lot of people to him because of his sincerity. Even if you watch him speaking, I can't speak German, but if I watch him speaking, he looks totally certain. And a lot of people go through life a bit unsure. They're sort of conditioned to feel like that by the miasma. And then dangerous people like that can take advantage of that uncertainty by being incredibly certain. And it happens in really dangerous situations like that, where, effectively the popularity of a guy who appears very, very certain propels him into a position where he can do incredible harm to humanity. But it happens in lesser situations as well. Two of my martial arts students years ago, they were involved on different sides of an argument. This is many years ago. They know who they are. Many years ago, on one of these internet discussion groups about martial arts. And they were both arguing, although they're both my students, they were both arguing the opposite sides of this particular argument. One of them put quite a well-reasoned case that I thought was quite cool and reasonable. That was in the days when I used to read these things. That's long ago. And the other one was just talking. It was a historical argument, and the other one had mixed up two different historical figures. But the one who'd got it basically got the wrong end of the stick and mixed up two different historical figures, was saying it in a totally certain, I am right.
Absolutely.
It's definitely like this. And so all the people in the discussion group who didn't know were attracted to the guy who was wrong, and the guy who was right got a pretty hard time.
You bring up a really interesting point, though, because text-based communicative systems such as the internet and discussion groups like that, they really do bring out like the worst in people, because I don't know, just text is not the right medium to have a debate, because you're just not, all you do is you go, I know what's what, and then no matter what, you can't, there's no humanity there, there's no ability to have a reasoned discussion. I mean, some people do, but it's very difficult.
Yeah.
Text is one of those, what we might call baseline activities. It's very rational, very logical, and it's very devoid of that emotional connection.
It's baseline to people. And again, this is another aspect of the miasma. The miasma also arises out of an obsession with the baseline. Now, we don't really have time on this episode to go through what the baseline, midline, and top line are, but as a very brief summary, your baseline is your thinking, rational, logical, working things out, problem-solving kind of line in terms of logical problems. Your midline is a physical sort of line, and your top line is like your limbic system. That's your emotional, it's how you feel. It's not what you think, it's how you feel. And in wild animals, those three lines, these are each lines of their trigrams. Each trigram has three lines. In wild animals, which incidentally is represented throughout the world in many different cases, which we've gone into in lots of details. It's not just the trigram. The trigram is a fantastic example of it. Exactly. Every ancient culture
because it's shamanic, right? And shamanic is universal.
Exactly. It comes from nature, right? So the key point with these lines is wild animals use them all equally. When they problem solve, if they have a midline kind of problem, they use a midline response. If they have a baseline problem, they use a baseline response. If they have a top line problem, they use a top line response. The problem with miasmatic peoples, civilized settled peoples, is they don't. If there's a top line problem, they use a baseline response. If there's a midline problem, they use a baseline response. If there's a baseline problem, they use a baseline response. And it's this obsession for the baseline, which is encoded in the painting by Fan Quan, who we have been talking about on the Heretics podcast.
Episode 4, I believe.
Was that on the Woven Energy podcast? Yeah, yes. Episode 4 on the Woven Energy podcast. It's a very recent episode. I think episode before last on the Heretics podcast. That's the one about the first one about the Shingi Part 1. And so that guy painted this famous painting, Travelers Among Mountains and Streams, that encodes this baseline obsession of civilized human beings. And as we said on the Heretics podcast, he was part of a movement called the Li movement that was trying to turn people back towards nature. They were trying to answer the question why the mighty Tang dynasty had fallen, why the mighty Han dynasty had fallen. And they sort of figured out that those people early in those dynasties that built those great dynasties had a certain level of respect for nature. And the people late in the dynasties, got control late in their dynasties, really didn't. And they were trying to, when the start of the Song dynasty, they were trying to turn people's heads back towards nature, which is what I think we need in our civilization right now. And I think, there was a sort of attempt at an archaic revival during the 90s, which I was very kind of excited about at the time. I think, as I've said. But it ended up being
Terence McKenna, the archaic revival.
Yeah. And it's what we need as a species. It's what we need if we're not going to destroy our planet, basically, and ourselves along with it. Actually, it's just ourselves we're going to destroy, isn't it? The planet will still be here.
The planet will carry on.
But the key point is that turning away from nature that happens with civilization. There's some great things that rise out of civilization. We've got modern medicine, we've got modern technology, all this kind of stuff. There's some wonderful stuff. I'm not saying that stuff's bad. What I'm saying is, in gaining that stuff, we have lost something. And shamanism and esotericism are two different ways of trying to get a bit of that back or preserve a bit of that from the ancient world. And both of those subjects are about minimizing the effect of the miasma upon us, because the miasma is the main kind of negative part of the benefits that come to us from civilization. And well mentioned on Terence McKenna, because Terence McKenna called the miasma dominator culture. And I have a quote from him. I think we read it out previously, but I'm going to read it again. As a species, we need to acknowledge the depth of our historical dilemma. We will continue to play with a half deck as long as we continue to tolerate cardinals of government and science who presume to dictate where human curiosity can legitimately focus its attention and where it cannot. That's another issue with the miasma, is subjects that are subjects and subjects that are non-subjects. A friend of ours recently sort of mentioned to me that when he tried to discuss or investigate some shamanistic type of issues with one of his friends, he actually got a pretty negative response to that. And I guess a lot of long-term listeners to the Woven Energy podcast who have been practicing
like
exorcisms,
culty stuff and religion, because they would mix up what you might call exterior religion and this strange thing. But
and that's why esotericism arose. That's why secret societies arose, to study this stuff. Famous ones like the Knights Templar and the Freemasons and the Rosicrucians, and then in the Far East, you've got people like the Black Dragon Society, and the Cherry Blossom Society. These are people that study these sort of subjects, esoteric subjects. They create secret societies, and they were secret for a very good reason. They were secret because the average miasmatically conditioned members of their society, if they knew what those people were studying in those societies, would have a very negative, possibly violent, possibly fatal reaction. I mean, fatal to the person in the secret society. And that's why they were secret.
Or dob them into the gaffer.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. And so you can see why these things were secret. Yeah. And secret societies is something that we've touched on a little bit on the Heretics podcast, but our intention is to do a lot more stuff on secret societies in the future in Heretics. So when we do that, there'll be a lot more chance to explore the miasma and what it means, and what esoteric societies do. In some ways, esoteric societies have become more sophisticated in dealing with the miasma than have shamanistic cultures. Shamanistic cultures don't have very much miasma. Certainly among hunter-gatherer societies, there's hardly anything there, so they don't have to worry about it too much until somebody comes along from one of these dominator cultures and tries to dominate them, which always happens. But that's an external influence, So Terence McKenna's idea of cultures that try to dominate people is very much a part of it.
He's a good one to get into, isn't he, Terence McKenna? Yeah. If you want to research a bit about shamanism.
Yeah, I think my favourite modern book is Food of the Gods by Terence McKenna. It's my number one modern book. I mean, some books from the past that I'm more partial to, Chemical Wedding and these sort of, some books like that, the I Ching. But if for modern times, I think that's my number one book, Food of the Gods. So there's a high level recommendation for Mr. McKenna's Food of the Gods.
Which is one of the things that obviously when people think Terence McKenna, people will think psychedelics, and you are a big proponent of they are useful as a tool, but only if you reach a certain stage, and it's not like
Sure. And that's all about shamanistic technique and at what stage their use is appropriate within the development of a shaman. I
suppose that's kind of harking back to how important you think the miasma is on us, because if you do experiment with certain substances like that, and you are victim, you open yourself up to be victim to your miasma.
That's
rather than nature.
Exactly.
And that's the core of the reason why you need to get to a certain level before you even contemplate trying those out.
Exactly. They are catalysts, and you want them catalyzing your shamanic technique. You definitely don't want them catalyzing your miasma, which they will if you use them without the proper preparation, without the proper bat, tushultine and guchach in place. And another thing that I've said on that front is that their use is not necessary for shamanistic technique. It's perfectly possible to go to the very highest levels of shamanistic technique without ever using catalysts, at least that type of catalyst. There are other catalysts like a drum. And so, but that's not a subject we want to get into on this podcast, because we're here helping out the Heretics podcast. If people are interested in practicing shamanism, then they need to start. They're never going to learn that from Heretics. They need to start listening to Woven Energy. If they're not, then let's not burden this.
So yeah, absolutely. So recognizing the miasma is a tough one. Besides obviously starting the beginning of this podcast and going through the stage one of shamanic technique, which is chillicity. What could somebody do to start just recognizing fragments and tiny things? Because it starts with the fragments. It starts with the little things you notice about yourself. Maybe how you interact with people. Maybe how you filter things coming to you. Like somebody has an opinion about something that isn't. It conflicts with your opinion. How do you react to that? There's certain little things that people can do to just start recognizing flavors of this miasma, and from that you can then build a resilience to it.
Within yourself, you have to want to do that. That's the starting point. If you don't want to do that, if you don't want to try, and I don't believe that that's possible without practicing some level of shamanic technique. But it could be a quite lightweight shamanic technique. I mean, I think one that immediately springs to mind in that context is go out and be somebody else for a day. So you have a certain set of beliefs, things you believe, things that you think are important in life. Create a person for a day who has different beliefs to you, who has a different view on the world to you, has different priorities and places different values on things. And go out and be that person for a day. I don't mean pretend, I mean just go and be that person for a day. That is a shamanistic technique. There's a lot of Toshaltine in that, but it's quite a lightweight one, so that's something you could do. But if you do that, you have started, albeit in a very lightweight way, started practicing shamanistic technique. And I think one of the lower levels of shamanistic technique, the Bhaktamshe Saub and the Amshka, those things are specifically there to rid you of your miasma. That's what they're for in the shamanic state. But I don't think that from the Heretics point of view, from the Heretics podcast point of view, it's particularly important, because all we want to create is a recognition of it, that something's there. And give you I think a really concrete example from nature is a good one. We did go over this previously, but I'll just briefly go over this. This is real physiological evidence, biological evidence, if you like, that the miasma has affected us. As tool using animals, the miasma, the capacity for the miasma, not the miasma itself, the capacity for the miasma was a side effect of the fact that we needed to create tools. Now, if anybody's tried flint knapping, that's turning a piece of flint into an arrowhead or something like that. It's quite a difficult thing to do. And you have to be able to visualize stuff. Ahead of it appearing in the world, you visualize the arrowhead and then you make shards off the piece of flint gradually and sequentially until the arrowhead that you've visualized comes to life. We need to be able to imagine something ahead of time that doesn't yet exist in order to do that kind of tool-making activity. The problem with that is that we can then start imagining other things that don't exist, like Satan, for instance, or witches, or, other things that don't exist that are perhaps not so helpful as flint arrowheads are to hunter-gatherer peoples. And there's actually a physiological change has happened in our brains because we are this kind of animal compared to other primates, primates being our closest relatives. Bonobos and chimpanzees, I guess you would say, would be our closest relatives. And this thing called the lunate sulcus. The lunate sulcus is an actual physical division in the brains of apes, including bonobos and chimpanzees, our close relatives. And what it does is it separates the area of the brain that's concerned with visualization from other areas of the brain. And what that means is to those animals, our wild animals, it means visualization, the visual aspect of life is a tool to them. And like I said, they reflect nature very directly. They reflect nature like a mirror. And this physically separates the visualization area of the brain to other areas of the brain. It's actually a fissure or fold or a cleft in the brain that does that. And all of the primates have it. And the brains of one primate, human beings, don't. It's been lost. It's been lost to us. And this is partly because of this need to visualize tools ahead of time when we're making them. And, making spears or whatever we're making. And that's why we're so good at that. But we've lost this distinction between visualization as a tool and visualization as part of reality, part of our reality. Things that we visualize and we invent in our minds can now become completely real to us. I can invent a religion and I can visualize it. It's something completely fictitious. I made it up in my own head. But then if I believe in it strongly enough, the value of other people's lives becomes less and less to me. And in very extreme cases, people can get themselves in the place where they're willing to go and kill people over this fictitious religion they've invented in their heads. That's how bad it is among humans. Now, no wild animal would ever do that. They might kill people for other reasons. Like, a tiger's looking at somebody and think, yummy, yeah. That's a completely different thing. But they're not thinking...
It's not thinking it has a different religion.
The tiger's not thinking, I'm going to take him out because he's not worshipping God in the way that I think he should, He's
laid 3 stones at the altar instead of 4.
Yeah, exactly. Okay. And also brain casts of fossil skulls show that this was this loss of this distinction between visualization and reality in human beings. It was already well underway at the time of Australopithecus africanus. That's 2.5 to 3 million years ago. We started losing this capability. Yeah, and so the division between the kind of visualization and the reality is weakened in order to support our analytical behavior, behavior based on the baseline. Flint napping's an example of that. And, you can think of things that having created for that purpose, because we're good at making tools, and, we talk about martial arts a lot on the Heretics podcast, and we use tools in those martial arts. We call those tools spears and swords and maces and hammers and, chain whips and all this kind of stuff, And in our society, it supports the derivation or the development of social organizational models, materialism. There's the famous story about, they go down to, the merchant goes across to some Aboriginal people and asks to buy their land off them for some beads. And then he comes away, and they take the beads. He comes away sniggering to himself, thinking, "Oh, these stupid hunter-gatherers, they're willing to give away their land for a few beads." And the hunter-gatherers are walking away sniggering, thinking, "This guy thinks he can own land."
Yeah. The sad fact is, the guy'll go back with a bloody army, though.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
And
it's true.
That is true, but they're not expecting that, are they? Yeah. When that happens, we talked about the Evenks. There's a great episode we did on Woven Energy for Heretics listeners on the Evenki people and how they dealt with the Christians who came heavy-handed into their realm, into their lands. They're quite clever. It's quite funny how they dealt with them. Very ably, actually, relatively speaking. But of course, it's hardship imposed upon them. And so then you come on to the subject of exoteric religion, which is a big one that we'll be covering in Heretics in the future. Exoteric religion being religion that's based, like most religions in settled civilized societies, on the idea of faith and belief, as opposed to esoteric religion, which is based on technique and experimentation, like shamanism, like animism, and like esotericism. Some secret societies, Rosicrucianism, for instance. And there's a spectrum between those two ends. But, this will be a big subject for the future of the Heretics podcast. And this exoteric religion, this religion based on belief and faith, again, people are conditioned to think that having faith and having belief are good things, keep the faith and stuff like that, never thinking that perhaps maybe they're not good or bad things, they're just things. And in some cases, they can be just as bad as they are good. I think recently we mentioned on Heretics that, faith in Buddhism's this lovely, peaceful religion as we see it in the West. And, we all get a shock when we hear a Buddhist group put sarin gas down the Tokyo subway. Yeah. And so I think that's not a bad, very, very brief overview of the subject of what the miasma is.
Yeah, I mean, it's like it's the age-old. Well, it's the universal truth of duality, isn't it? So we've gained the yin and the yang. We've gained a lot from civilization in one respect, but we've also lost a lot through civilization in another respect. And it's what we've lost is what we're trying to regain. And
yeah.
The miasma is what's sitting between us and what we've lost.
Yeah, I think that, we give a lot of examples in our miasma episodes. I'm going to give one concrete example of the miasma at work. Just because I like this one. Also, it's relevant to some of the stuff we've been talking about in Heretics. And I apologize to Woven Energy people because you've heard this before, but I'm going to summarize it more briefly than we did previously. On the slopes of Mount Fuji, there's a forest called Aokigahara, which means the blue sea of trees, or the blue-green sea of trees, or plain of trees. And that's a very beautiful forest. I mean, Mount Fuji itself is beautiful. We mentioned Mount Fuji in the episodes about Qinshue Huangdi. There's an expedition to Mount Fuji, supposedly, to bring back the elixir of eternal life for the first emperor of China. That expedition went a bit pear-shaped, but there was such an expedition. But anyway, this beautiful forest on the slopes of Mount Fuji. And in Japanese society, there's a long history of suicide. Famously the samurai class were into this thing seppuku, which was a sort of socially respectable way out, as when it was either execution or killing yourself. And so they took this sort of socially acceptable way out. When they became sort of capitalist materialist, when that was introduced following the sort of events around the Meiji Restoration, the Boshin War, they adopted Western ways, and they got themselves in a bit of a position where you had kaishin businessmen who worked for one company all their life, I guess like my teacher did, worked for one company in Japan, or one Japanese company all his life. I worked for that company in different countries around the world, but he did work for one company all his life. And they get in a position where they're supporting their family, they have a regular life, they're an extremely ingrained life. Their role in the world is very meshed into the role and the structure of society. And it's a very organized life. And then all of a sudden, in modern times, a lot of these people get laid off. They just get dropped, in a modern Western kind of, hey, you might have worked for us for 30 years, but we don't need you anymore. And to them, it's an incomprehensible thing. And a lot of them, unfortunately, were driven to suicide over this thing. For whatever reason, they have this propensity to suicide, and a lot of them are driven to suicide. And that's the miasma working on them. The social miasma is that they need to be the supporter of their wife and their children and their family, and they need to be respectable in the eyes of their friends. And the fact that they're not going to be is such a pain to them that they feel they have to kill themselves. And that's the miasma working on them. But not only that, the miasma doesn't just tell them to kill themselves. The miasma tells them where to kill themselves. They're expected to go to Aokigahara on the slopes of Mount Fuji and do it there. There is a very extreme example it's all self-policed, right? It's all themselves deciding to do this. There's no police turning up at their door and dragging them to Aokigahara and forcing them to kill themselves there. It's them themselves doing this. And it is the miasma working within them for, you could call it evil ends, that is causing it's entirely within their own mind. There's nothing outside of them making them do that. And, that shows you how bad the miasma can be within an individual.
It hits very close to home, does that, Damon? Because a friend of mine, a very good friend of mine's father, unfortunately took his own life because of that as well. And it wasn't. Yeah, it just goes to show how devastating the miasma can be on you, and how very real things can feel and can drive you to that kind of action is obscene, really.
And this is what people like McKenna and myself, I guess you would say, something I have massively in common with Terence McKenna. We would like to see society infused. That stuff doesn't happen in hunter-gatherer societies, right? I hope everybody's aware of this. That just doesn't happen. Yeah, it wouldn't even occur to them. In fact, if you told them that story, they'd probably either cry or laugh.
I'll be deeply confused.
It wouldn't register with them. And so, can we get a little bit of that back? Can we have a deeper rather than a less superficial? I did enjoy the rather superficial archaic revival of the 90s, dancing to the shaman and all that stuff, the raves and all that. But it was very, very superficial.
It comes in waves, isn't it? Because people know that it's missing and they know that this thing exists on some level. And so these things like the archaic revival keep ebbing and flowing in society.
Yeah. And so thinking, just to finish off, thinking about the miasma and shamanic technique, the miasma affects you through culturally imposed circumstances. That's how it infects you, and it infects you from childhood onwards. But it is possible to give yourself experiences in which it's not your culture, but nature itself that is influencing you. And that so basically, miasma infects you through culturally imposed circumstance, but it is possible to give yourself experience in which that's not happening, and instead of culture, it's nature that's influencing you. That is a definition of shamanic technique. That's what shamanic technique actually is.
Perfect. Okay, Damon, been an absolute pleasure. I think this has been a cracking episode. Again,
likewise, mate.
It's just like a recap on one of the more important things, I guess. It is shamanism at the end of the day.
It's great to get you involved with heretics, mate.
Yeah, good stuff.
Yeah.
So let's quickly recap then. Not recap, we've already done that, but let's mention Patreon again. So it's patreon.com/woven energy. We would be eternally grateful. And we'll mention you on the podcast if you wish to be mentioned and all that good stuff. And you can be very sure that your support is going to straight back into this to ultimately serve you in the future as well. So if you do fancy supporting us, then go to patreon.com/woven energy. We really appreciate it. Do you want to add anything else before we wrap
that's
things
good,
up?
mate. That's good.
Right. Cracking. So welcome to the Woven Energy Podcast, all of you lovely people coming from the Heretics Podcast. Anybody over here who's interested in the Heretics Podcast, go check that out as well. It's Damon and Graham.
Yeah, search up for Heretics by Woven Energy.
Heretics by Woven Energy. It's essentially, do we think about it as the same podcast? It's kind of all connected, isn't it?
Well, it's all the stuff we could have talked about on this podcast, but it would have slowed us down to the point where we wouldn't get any technique done. Yeah.
All right, guys. So head to wovenenergy.com/start-here for your exclusive Get Started episode, where I poke and prod and try and get Damon to talk about a few more controversial things. So you can head over there and get an exclusive Get Started episode. Thanks ever so much, guys. If you are kind-hearted enough, you can head to iTunes as well and give us a nice 5-star review if, of course, you think we're deserving of such. And just look out for the next episode where we're going to be definitely revisiting Stage 3. Stage 3, we're going to be talking about the Spirit Dance and cracking on with that. So looking forward to it, and we'll see you then.
All the best, mate. Thanks.
Cool.